Hi guys, thank you for clicking on the video. This video, as you can probably tell by the title, is going to be diving into movement dysfunctions and how you can fix them. So this is going to be a video series where I dive into different movement dysfunctions, define movement dysfunctions, certain ones that I see very often in the gym, why they are a problem, and how you can go about fixing them. So there's a lot of information that I am planning on going over in this video series, and that's why I've decided to break it down into multiple videos, because especially this first part here where I'm going to give a lot of definitions, it's going to be pretty dense. So just to make sure that I don't lose any of your guys' attention, and to make it a little bit easier to digest, I'm going to break this into probably 4 videos. So this first video is going to, like I said, dive into the definitions that, like I said, are going to be pretty dense and a little bit hard to digest, but try to bear with me because these definitions are really going to pay dividends in the later stages of this video series, where I go into specific movement dysfunctions in the gym and how you can go about fixing them. But before we go into those, I'd like to explain why it is that movement dysfunctions happen and the different kinds of mechanisms behind them. So let's start out by defining what a movement dysfunction is. So a movement dysfunction is defined as impairments in the speed, fluency, quality, and ease of movement. So essentially your body is somehow put into a suboptimal position to perform because of muscular imbalances, and doing these movements in a dysfunctional pattern is just going to further exacerbate those muscular imbalances and potentially lead to injury. So not only can performing an exercise suboptimally potentially lead to injury, but you're just not working the muscles that you are trying to work when your body is moving dysfunctionally. So I will first define the 2 different kinds of muscular systems in the body. There is the stabilization muscular system and the mobilization muscular system. Stabilizer muscles are more prone to underactivity and weakness. So examples of muscles in the stabilization muscular system are the gluteus medius, so that outer glute muscle, the rotator cuff, the internal obliques, and the transverse abdominis. Those are just a few examples. And then we have the mobilization muscular system, and these muscles are more prone to overactivity and being tight. So whereas the stabilization muscles were more prone to being weak, these ones are more prone to being tight. So some examples of muscles in the mobilization muscular system are the gastrocnemius, so one of the calf muscles, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the erector spinae, and the lats, or latissimus dorsi. So now that we've defined the 2 different muscular systems and how they can be prone to underactivity or overactivity, I'm going to describe how that can lead to movement dysfunction. So essentially there are 3 mechanisms, or main mechanisms, behind movement dysfunction. And that would be altered length tension relationships, altered force couple relationships, and altered arthrokinematics. I know those are some pretty extensive terms, but don't worry, I'm going to try to break those down as simple as possible. So first mentioned is altered length tension relationships. So a length tension relationship just refers to there being a direct relationship between the length of a muscle and its ability to produce tension or force. So there is an optimal length at which a muscle is able to produce the most amount of tension or force. So if you didn't know, muscles, they cross joints and they can either become shortened or stretched. So this idea of the length tension relationship just means that when a muscle is Typically, when it's shortened, it's producing the most amount of tension. And when it's lengthened or stretched out, it's not really producing much. So going back to the idea of muscular imbalances, when muscles are chronically tight or chronically weak, it's going to affect the length of the muscle on each side of the joint. So this can negatively impact the amount of force or tension a muscle is able to produce, and strength and power can be negatively impacted because of this. The next mechanism that I mentioned is altered force-couple relationships. So a force-couple relationship is the idea that muscles will work synergistically to slow down movement, cause movement, and to stabilize the body in all three planes of motion. An example of this is the quadriceps and the hamstrings. So both of these muscles cross both the knee joint and the hip joint, but for the sake of this explanation, let's just look at it at the knee joint. So the quadriceps will extend the knee and the hamstrings will flex the knee. So when one of these muscles contracts to cause movement in whatever movement it's supposed to do, then the other muscle is supposed to consequently relax and lengthen out. If one of those muscles is extremely overactive or tight, it'll affect the other muscle's ability to contract and produce force. So if my quadriceps are very, very tight and it's constantly pulling on my knee to extend, then my hamstrings are going to be less able to produce an optimal amount of force to flex the knee. The third mechanism that I listed is altered arthrokinematics. Arthrokinematics is defined as the movement of joint surfaces as a bone moves through a range of motion. Examples of these movements is gliding, sliding, translation, and rolling. These movements are primarily controlled by the central nervous system, but are also controlled by surrounding muscles of the kinetic chain. I will dive a bit deeper into this mechanism a bit later in the video series and give an example so it's a little bit easier to explain. So as if that wasn't enough dense information all compacted into a few minutes, I'm going to give a few other definitions before we dive into the actual examples. So these three mechanisms occurring can ultimately result in reciprocal inhibition, synergistic dominance, arthrokinematic inhibition, relative flexibility, and pattern overload. So the first one, reciprocal inhibition, just refers to increased neural drive or decreased extensibility of a muscle. The agonist will decrease neural drive of the antagonist muscle. A good example of this is tight hip flexors, making it more difficult for someone to be able to contract their glutes. So I have dealt with this in the past. I've struggled a lot with glute activation. I have what a lot of people have coined the term sleepy glutes, where your glutes just don't do anything, they don't contract. I've gotten a lot better at it over the past years since learning about some of these definitions and being able to apply it in my own training. But essentially, the hip flexors obviously will flex at the hip, and the glutes are hip extensors, so they do the opposite. They extend the hip. So as mentioned earlier with force couple relationships, when the hip flexors are tight and overactive, then my glutes are going to be more stretched out and unable to produce an optimal amount of force. The next on the list was synergistic dominance. Synergistic dominance refers to synergist and stabilizer muscles taking over to compensate for underactivity of a prime mover during functional movement. So going back to the previous example of underactive glutes, if my glutes are not really able to take on the load or just not really in an optimal position to contract and produce a lot of force, then other muscles are going to have to take over for that. And in this case, it would be the erector spinae and the hamstrings. So although the glutes are the main extensor of the hip, the erector spinae and the hamstrings do also contribute. They're just supposed to be secondary to the glutes. But if the glutes are underactive and not contracting properly, then the erector spinae and the hamstrings are going to have to take dominance over that just to make up and compensate for the lack of activity of the glutes. The next one, arthrokinematic inhibition, just refers to inhibition of movement resulting from lack of joint surface movement. Relative flexibility just refers to the body's tendency to take the path of least resistance during functional movement patterns. So an example of this that's pretty common is the feet turning out during a squat. So if somebody starts with their feet or their toes pointing straight forward, when you're descending into a squat, you need to have dorsiflexion at the ankle. And if your calves are tight, then your dorsiflexion range of motion is going to be limited. In order to take some of that demand of dorsiflexion off of your calves, your feet will turn out, shorten off the lateral gastrocnemius a little bit, just so it doesn't have to stretch as much when you go down into the squat. The last on that list is pattern overload. And pattern overload just refers to when there's repetitive recruitment of the same muscle fibers in the same range of motion or plane of motion at the same speed, and that creates tissue overload, which can cause eventual injury. So essentially continuing to do a dysfunctional movement pattern over and over again and teaching your body to stay in that in a suboptimal posture while doing movement, especially under heavy load, is just teaching your body to stay in that position, in that suboptimal position. For example, lifting with excessively pronated shoulders, with your shoulders also elevated. So I see a lot of guys, especially maybe girls do it too, I don't know, but body weight dips, where you're just trying to straighten out the arm and work the triceps, but I see a lot of people doing it with, the weight belt, tons of plates loaded on there, and their shoulders are just like this and rolled forward and pronated, and next thing you know, they're walking around like this. Their levator scapulae is tight, their pecs are tight, and they're just probably not going to be able to contract their upper back a lot in rows, and then other muscles will take over in the rows. Like mentioned earlier, if the upper back is not functioning properly, but I'll get into that later. But essentially just teaching your body to stay in that posture, especially when you're doing it under a heavy load, and then you're just going to have that posture. And having suboptimal posture is obviously not good, but essentially with the example of the pronated and elevated shoulders while lifting, that's just going to compromise shoulder joint stability and, like I said, can lead to injury. So now that it's established why movement dysfunctions are bad and some of the mechanisms behind why they happen, how do you go about fixing it? How do you know if the common movements that you're performing in the gym are dysfunctional and inhibiting your ability to progress, or even potentially setting you up for an injury? In part 2 of this video series, I am going to dive into some common movement dysfunctions in the squat. So thank you for tuning into this video. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. This is probably going to be my first video that I'm releasing. I'm not totally sure yet, but my channel is primarily going to be a lot of informative content like this that I don't really see much of on YouTube already, at least from what I've seen. I mean, I have gathered some information from watching some people like Omar Izaf and Brandon Tietz of Aesthetic Strength, and a couple of other very informative training channels, but I've also gathered a lot of this information from just reading textbooks and looking at really good credible resources online, and also through my education as a 2-year diploma personal fitness trainer student, which I am going to be graduating from in April. So again, thank you for clicking on the video. Please don't forget to go to the next video, the next part of the series. Like I said, I think there'll be 4 parts, maybe 5 to the series. And if you want to figure out some of the common movement dysfunctions in the squat, some of what you may be doing and how to go about fixing them, then don't forget to go on to the next video. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.